Madam President, I rise to talk about the oil spill in the Gulf and the continuing challenges that it presents to us. And I know some of my colleagues are going to be joining me in a few moments to talk about this, and I'll ask consent for a colloquy. But I'm going to make a few comments about it, and then in recognition of Senator Inhofe's need to move to another commitment, I'll ask unanimous consent at that time. Madam President, I want to make absolutely certain that big oil polluters pay for oil spills and not the taxpayers, not small business owners, not states or the federal government, which means the federal taxpayers. Now, we have seen things get worse on this spill over the weekend. Unfortunately, things are frankly getting much worse than we would have imagined when we first introduced this legislation. Today, the United States declared a fishing disaster in 3 Gulf states, in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Louisiana's alone $2.4 billion seafood supplies up to 40% of all the U.S. seafood in our country. So it is, in my mind, a growing and continuing environmental and economic disaster. Now, tragically, it seems to me that a $10 billion cap, which we originally thought, based upon the Exxon Valdez experience, in where there were clearly close to $4 billion in claims 20 years ago, was a cap that may have been an appropriate one. But in fact, it seems to me that the only way to ensure that oil companies are held accountable for all of their potential damages, for the proposition that a polluter pays at the end of the day, is to agree with the administration's statement and to raise from a cap of $75 million to an unlimited cap, and I will be doing that in my consent motion in a few minutes. Now, we've heard already the objections to our legislation. We have even heard some claim that it is, quote, un-American to hold a multi-billion-dollar corporation accountable for the very disaster it caused. Boggles my mind, at least, as one senator, that there are those who believe that holding BP accountable for the disaster they created in the Gulf is un-American. Well, this is a chance to show if we stand with big oil companies or with small businesses, with fisheries, with coastal communities, with tourism, with hotels, with all of those individuals, fellow Americans who are being hurt by this disaster. It's an opportunity to say, do we stand up with the American taxpayer or with corporate shareholders? Seems to me the choice is pretty clear. Miles of coastline have already been affected. Environmentally sensitive wetlands are increasingly being under threat. And we've seen that despite the fact that the rig was, quote unquote, state of the art, that it obviously wasn't too safe to fail. Now the damage to the environment, to the economy of the Gulf, to the fishermen, to the small businesses, to the nation is mounting. So I hope my colleagues are ready to act, especially when we have the statements of BP that have been reiterated that they are going to subject themselves, even though there is a legal cap of $75 million, not for the cleanup, not for all the efforts that are going underway. Yes, that clearly is their responsibility, but a legal cap of $75 million for all of the liabilities for all of those coastal communities and fishermen and shrimp fishermen and commercial seafood processing plants and tourism and a whole host of other elements that are affected, that they'd be only limited to $75 million, less than 1 day of BP's profit. BP was making at the rate of $94 million a day. $75 million would be less than 1 day of BP's process. So if they say that they're going to be responsible, and that any companies similarly situated, I would argue, should be fully responsible, accountable, and subject to that liability, what is the objection to raising the cap? So I hope everyone in the chamber will do the right thing to hold big oil accountable for the damage they cause. Damages are mounting. They still have not stopped the leak. And while BP says they will pay all, quote, legitimate claims, their words not legally binding. As a matter of fact, when they were before the Energy Committee, colleagues of mine asked them clearly questions, and they began to equivocate as to what is a legitimate claim. Today, I asked the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, who was before the Energy Committee, is there a consent agreement between the government and BP that holds them legally binding to the proposition that they will be subject to all the liabilities that they have caused? And the answer was no. There is some letter, but even that letter is rather amorphous. And so when I hear they're equivocating before their committee, and when I see the experience we already had with Exxon, who made all similar types of statements and then litigated for 20 years, it seems to me that this clearly raises concerns that they'll try to find a convenient loophole, a convenient way out once the public relations nightmare is over, a way to say no, just like many of my colleagues seem to want to say no and stand on the side of big oil companies in the way of legislation that would raise the liability cap to ensure that big oil polluters pay for the damage they cause. So it seems to me, when I see, just by example, one company, BP, made nearly $6 billion in profits, not proceeds, profits, in 3 months of this year, when the top 5 oil companies made nearly $25 billion in profits, not proceeds, profits, in 3 months, that somehow we are worried about them even when they cause the type of potential enormous consequences that BP has actually caused in this case, and not worried about those communities, our taxpayers, and our fragile ecosystem. It's a failure that now threatens the entire Gulf Coast, could go all the way to the Florida Keys. I appreciate that the administration earlier today embraced the idea of unlimited liability. I want to commend them for that. I want to make sure that BP ends up committing to pay for this disaster, not by their words, but by a legal obligation to do so, and that's what we can create today. There should be no legal wiggle room for oil companies that devastate coastal businesses and communities now or in the future. So in view of that goal, I'd like to now, Madam President, ask unanimous consent that the Environment and Public Works Committee be discharged of S-3305, the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Unlimited Liability Act of 2010, that the Senate proceed to its consideration, that the amendment in order be the substitute amendment that is at the desk, that the substitute amendment be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time, pass, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table.
Reserving the right to object.
Is there an objection? Senator
Reserving
from
the right to object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, first of all, I'm disappointed because I appreciate what the distinguished senator from Oklahoma said, but the reality is the administration has been thoughtful. They've thought about it. And today they announced, as well as was verified by the Assistant Attorney General at a hearing, that it is their view that, in fact, there should be an unlimited cap. So it's not, they have not equivocated about an amount. They have now said that it should be an unlimited cap. unlimited, just as BP has suggested that they're going to accept unlimited responsibility for the liability that they have created as a result of the spill in the Gulf. And I really have a difficulty understanding when we begin to talk about sizes that if you're smaller but conduct the same potential risky consequences that end up polluting the Gulf or any place else as it is being polluted right now, that because you're simply smaller, but you take the same risks, that you should have less liability, which means that then all of us as taxpayers, and I know a lot of people here don't want to see the federal government more involved, they want to see the federal government less involved until they need the federal government, and then they come clamoring to this chamber for money. So it seems to me that if these companies, and he only mentioned the top 5, but there's more that have good profits, but certainly the top 5, if they made $25 billion in 3 months, why in God's name should I give them any of the taxpayers' money when they mess up, when they pollute? What representative of what state is going to come here and say, give us money because, by the way, we were harmed in this way or that way or the other, when, in fact, they're unwilling to hold the oil companies responsible with record profits? Not acceptable. And now if we say, well, if you're not one of the big 5s, but we're worried about, maybe the next 10, well, they may be smaller, but some of these entities, who get referred to as independents, well, there's one that actually owns 25% stake in the well that is spilling in the Gulf. They're valued at $40 billion. $40 billion. I don't think for the average American that's mom or pop. The reality is regardless of the size, the fundamental public policy question, if you take an activity that is risky, should you not be responsible for the consequences of your risky activity, or do we shift the responsibility to the general public and the taxpayer? It's like what we just went through in the Wall Street debate. So when you hit it big on the oil well and everything goes well, you keep the money. But when something goes wrong, the rest of us pay for the consequences. I don't think the American taxpayers want to see that. That is not what they have in mind as being responsive to their interests.